My name is Yuqing Chen, and I'm current intern at SideFX. And during this internship, I'm mainly focused on the Solaris part. So today, I'm very happy to have this opportunity to share some knowledge about Solaris and also the work I did during my internship. So let's get started.
So Solaris is a new lighting, shading, and layout system comes with Houdini 18, and it's designed for creating and editing USD files. So speaking of USD, I know some of you may already familiar with USD concept, but I still want to spend several minutes to give you a brief introduction about USD file. So here is a very rough draw, but I think it's very useful to show the basic idea of USD workflow. So imagine that USD stands for Universal Scene Description. That is a file format developed by Pixar for several years. So basically, USD is designed for collaborations that allows you to have multiple different departments working on the same shot, but without affecting each other. So imagine that if we have, for example, with this draw, we have a shot that is about a tree, okay? And we have multiple departments working on it. So for example, FX department want to take this tree asset, actually is a USD asset, to do the next step simulation, okay? So this will lead to the very first feature of USD, that is non-destructive workflow. That means you cannot delete anything from USD. So in our case, FX department take this USD asset, but they cannot delete any part of it, even a point. So, and for example, FX department want to apply simulation to this tree, right? They want to apply wind to bend this tree a little bit. So imagine that a tree geometry actually is a set data of point positions. And the bend tree simulation is actually to modify this set of data again. So this will lead to the second important feature of USD, that is layers. So USD working with layers. Imagine that if we are using Photoshop to process an image, so as a final result, an image can contain multiple layers, and the layer will override with each other. So USD expand this concept to 3D space. That means not only the point position data, but also like some arbitrary and custom attributes can be overridden. So in this case, FX department finished the simulation, and it actually output a new layer of data and apply back on top of our original tree geometry. So as a final result, it's not an image anymore, it's called a stage in USD. So a stage can contain multiple layers. In this case, it actually have two layers. So the top layer is the simulated point data. So the final result will be a simulated tree. So this is a very rough introduction about USD workflow. And the same case will be, so the lighting and render department will have the same case, okay? So so then we can talk about a little bit about Solaris. So I'm gonna go through three different examples today. Prepare an asset, set variants, and physical editing. So prepare an asset. The left one is the OBJ file I want to use today. That is a bar stool, and the right side one is the node network. But I'm going to do a live demo. So the first thing I want to do is to bring in the OBJ file into OBJ level, okay, object level by a geometry lock. So bring in this bar stool OBJ. So you can see here we have this asset and we have UV on it. Okay, so And the next step will be, if we switch to stage context, this is actually Solaris. And I want to switch from build layout to Solaris layout. So I want to introduce some very important tools for Solaris. The first one is here, the scene graph tree panel. So this panel actually helps you to track down what is the structure of your USD file, and also some very important attributes here like primitive type, variance, draw mode, and also some viewport control like active or deactivate, or visible or solo them. So down here we can see we have this scene graph details panel. That is actually a Solaris version of geometry spreadsheet. It gives you a lot of detailed information. And the third one is scene graph layers panel. So this panel helps you to know about how many layers you have, how about the layer stacking behavior, and how about the save control and the save path, basically where to save this layer. Okay, so the first lob I want to use is sub import lob. So this node actually helps you to grab some sub level stuff into Solaris. And we also have some other nodes can do this, like for example the scene import here. So this will basically grab all the stuff you have in once. But in this case, I would recommend to use this sub import. It's good for some smaller assets. And we can directly point our sub path to the file we have. Okay, so we have this bar stool. But the first option I want to use is here, called load as reference. So this will actually allows you to load this geometry, load this asset as a payload. So a payload is another USD concept. Basically, it allows you to load that asset, but without the cost, to load that into memory. Okay, so basically, it's a more efficient way to load an asset. So if we see the scene graph tree here, we actually have two prims already. One is the sub import one, which match the name on this node. And the second one is this mesh 0. So if we select the mesh 0 and look down in the scene graph details, we can see this mesh 0 actually carries some very detailed information. For example, the point information, normals, and UV. So this means this mesh 0 prim actually represents the geometry itself. And sub import one is actually a group type prim. Okay, so the second parameter I want to change is here, called prim path. This is actually how you organize your asset. So I want to do this like bar stool v1, and we already know that we will have a mesh 0 here. So I'm gonna put that down the geometry prim group. Okay. So with this change, we can see this set, we have a group barstool v1 group prim. Okay, with that, inside that we have this geometry, and our real geometry lay down this under this geom group. So the reason I do this is because in terms of an asset, I want to have the geometry group inside, and also I will have a material group inside. So the next step, oh yeah, here's another option I want to mention is down here. We have this group handling tab. And we have an option called treat polygons as subdivision surfaces. This will actually help you to divide asset at the render time. We'll subdivide this asset at the render time, okay? And if you want to see a more smooth result in the viewport, you can use this D key and geometry under this geometry tab, under this tessellation, and you can change this, increases a little bit, for example 1.5, and just force it to compile again. Now you can see it changed. Okay, so this is about sub import, and the next step is to assign material onto it. So I'm gonna use this material library lob. So this lob actually allows you to create shaders inside, just like the classic Houdini part. So I'm gonna directly borrow some shaders I created before. So this bars to original shader is actually a principal shader. And I just linked some different textures and tweak it a little bit. So nothing fancy here. And when you finish create the shaders, but we don't see anything here, right? In this scene graph path. So we need to authorize this shader on the material library. So for this material VOP, I'm gonna point to the materials we created. And for the material path, this is actually the material version of prim path here. So that helps you to organize your shader or your material group. So I'm going to use materials and bars to origin. So you can see here we have this material prim, and under this group we have our original shader, and we have some another shaders inside that is automatically generated. So now we have two different independent scene graph, right? One is about the asset and one is about our material. So the next step will be I want to reference the right side material scene graph tree into our left side main asset scene graph tree. Okay, so by using this reference lob, I will contact the asset to be the first input of this reference lob and our material information to be the second input. Okay, so by default, this reference lob allows you to browse USD file on the disk. But in this case, I'm going to change this reference type parameter to be reference from multi-input. That is actually bringing from second input. So now if we check our scene graph path, we actually have two things. One is Barstool V1 and one is our material, but the name changed because this reference node. So I'm going to organize this a little bit. I want to put our material information under this Barstool V1 group, but the tab gonna be material. Now, if we check this Barstool V1 asset, we actually have two groups, geometry and material, and we have our Barstool original laydown under this material group. So you may notice we got a warning here, right? This is basically saying you're not saving our material information. So as I mentioned before, all the different departments will generate a new layer of data. When you apply back this material info to the original one, you will have especially when you're using the second input of this reference lob, you're actually starting a new layer. So you need to save this layer. Otherwise, it will randomly save in your some random space in your memory. So I'm going to solve this by configure layer lob. So we have an option called save path here. This is actually help you to specify a place you want to save this. So I'm going to save it under the same directory of this Barstool V1 because I already do that. So basically, I just specify a location and to save it to be a USD file, the pure material to be a USD file. Okay, so now you can see the warning is gone. So the next step is actually do the assignment because we haven't done that yet. Okay, so by doing this, I'm using assign material lob. So this assign material lob actually helps you to specify which primitive you want to assign the material to and which material you want to use. So in this case, you can directly drag your geometry prim onto this parameter and drag the material you have. Okay, so now you can see the material was assigned. By checking that, we can directly select this geometry group, and under this scene graph details, we will see a new piece of information called material binding. And if we unfold that, we can see it directly points to the material path we have. Okay, and if we check this before, we don't have that. So that is saying we actually successfully assigned this material. So this is a basic form of an asset. But here I want to talk about one thing. If you click this button here, and here is a new information called kind. If you look into that, our asset, the barstool V1 is a group. And inside that, our geometry is a component kind of prim. Okay, let me bring out the help card. In this LOPS and USD glossary, you can actually search. Yeah. So we can see here, for the kind type attribute, we actually have 4 different values for that. Assembly, group, component, and subcomponent. So here is an example for this. Imagine we are working on a kitchen scene, right? So the kitchen technically is the biggest concept in this project. So we can define the kitchen prim to be an assembly. And maybe we have some dining table inside this kitchen. And we can define that kind of group to be a group type, okay? And if we have even smaller concept, for example, we have some chairs around this dining table, and we can define that kind of chair as a component type of group. And we have some much even smaller, like a cushion on this chair. We can define that to be a subcomponent. So basically, this kind type information, kind type attributes is help you to organize your stage in a logical way. And it will also affect the drawn mode here. So the drawn mode is you can change different mode to display this asset, okay? So this kind attribute is actually affecting this. For example, we have our drawn mode on our top type and component type, but we don't have it on this mesh zero type, mesh zero prim. This is because this mesh zero is actually a non-type of prim. So for demonstrate that, I'm going to change our group type a little bit. We can use this configure primitive to do that. If we change our barstool V1, the kind to be none, okay, so then we can see all the display option, the drawn mode option are gone. So for example, we change to subcomponent, it still doesn't work. This is because we have a component inside a subcomponent. So it's kind of invert way to organize this, okay? So if we change to bigger concept like assembly, it worked. Group, it worked. So yeah, that's about it. And the next part I want to talk about is set variance. So variance is another very powerful feature of USD that allows you to switch different states between different states of this asset. And also, even you can switch a totally different scene graph tree. That is fine. So I have an example here. That is, I have an asset, right? And for the top bar stool type of asset, I have 3 different shading variants for it. And beyond that, I can actually switch to the different modeling asset to be a new type of bar stool. And for the bottom one, for this dining stool, we have 3 different shading variants. Okay, so I'm gonna set up that. So for setup shading variants, we need to have 2 more shaders here. I will directly borrow from the shader I pre-made. So this is actually a principal shader and just different textures. So we create new shaders, but not assigned yet, right? Not registered yet. So we can use this auto fill materials button here to automatically set up this kind of parameters for us. When we press that, we can see under this primitive group, we have 3 different materials now, okay? And we already assigned one of them. Let me rename this original. And I would want to assign them twice. for the new materials. For the second one, I can directly grab this scratched to the material path and rename this to be scratched. And for the third one, we can actually assign this worn. So now we have 3 different materials, right? Let me make some space for this. So now you can see we actually have 3 different materials information here. So the next step is going to authorize this to be shading variants by use this add variants to new primitive. So this is actually an add variant lob, okay? So we directly connect all the material information to the second input of this add variant. And we can organize it a little bit, because now you can see we have a new layer of prim, but I don't want that. I want to change this to bar stool B1. And I also want to make the variant information appears on this group. So I set up this variant primitive parameter to be the same one. So now you can see, and also we can change this variant set name to be shading. So this is an arbitrary name and you can set up by yourself. So for this variance, you can see now we have a new information called shading. And if you right click onto that, we will have 3 different shading variants in this case. And I'm trying to switch it a little bit. So now we can see we have different shading variants, right? We just display them. Change. Yeah, we can switch from here, scratched or worn. And we can also do this if we duplicate this asset a little bit. Right? We have 10 different assets, and we can easily switch them between different shading variants by just set up them in the viewport. So this is very powerful and very easy to set up. But I want to mention that with this way, we actually create it in a very inefficient way, because we actually copy the geometry data three times. Because we only varies the material information, but we should share the same geometry data. But with this way, we directly connect all the material node to the second input. We actually copy them three times. So by avoiding that, I'm going to use a new lob. This add variant to existing primitive. So this is actually a loop block of nodes. And we can connect our asset to this first input of this variant block end. And also for this variant block begin. So for this variant block begin, we actually only have one option called perform layer break. So layer break is actually allows you to only save the data you changed, but not all of them. So with this way, you can avoid to save the same data again and again. So I'm gonna copy the 3 different material nodes. Okay, and we can connect this with this variant block again. And we can actually delete this. And just as the previous one, we directly connect our shading information to the second input. So now we can see, oh yeah, we need to set up this too. Bars to be one. Okay, so with this way, we can actually see we have the same results. We have 3 different shading variants, and we can switch between them. But I want to have a compare with this 2-way. So let me make some space. So the left side is actually a naive way to do this, because we keep saving the same data. The right side way is efficient way to do this. So if you right click on this add variant lob And here is a menu called lob actions, and we have an option called inspect active layer. So by clicking that, we actually have, we can see the USD file itself, okay? I'm gonna do the same thing on the right side, inspect active layer. So by checking the USD file, we can see what is the difference. Under this variant block, we have our original shading variants, right? And here, the depth geometry will actually append the first geometry, the geometry first time. And for the second scratched shading variants, we actually append again. And the same case, we append again. So actually, we load the geometry 3 times. But with the right side of the USD file, we actually, when we start doing this under this variant block, we actually have append this, load this geometry data once. And under that, when we're doing the original scratched and worn shading variants, we're actually using this over geometry. That means we share the same geometry data across all the shading variants, right? So imagine that if you are working on a very heavy scene, this will make your life much easier. Yeah, this is about variants. So the next feature I want to talk about is physical editing. So this is a very important, a very interesting feature to use. And it allows you to lay out stuff in the viewport interactively, okay? So I'm gonna, first I want to use a sublayer lob to browse the file, USD file on the disk. I'm gonna load my bar scene. So this is an example that I'm using the physical editing to lay out after dinner state of this dining table. So you can see it's really interesting to using this to lay out stuff, especially for that kind of classic layout jobs. You need to lay out a lot of small stuff onto somewhere. Yeah. So you can see here is my bar scene USD file, right? So for example, we want to lay out something onto this left corner dining table, okay? So for the efficiency, we want to isolate this part, only this dining table here. So we can select this table. So as I mentioned before, we cannot delete anything in USD. So in this case, I'm gonna only deactivate the rest of them by using this prune lob. And we can choose to deactivate them and unselect it, kind of invert the selection. So now we got this dining table. And I also want to bring in some small assets by this stage manager lob. So this stage manager lob is actually a very powerful lob to use. I can browse on the disk and to search some, in this case, I'm gonna randomly pick up some the USD asset I've made before. I just drag them into the left side. Okay, so poster, some fork maybe, and also this gin glass. So now we have 6 different, if we display this, we actually have 6 different assets. Let me change the view a little bit. Okay, so now we have several different assets, but they are overlapping at the origin. So the first thing I want to do is to move it a little bit, to try to avoid that overlapping. So this stage manager actually provides the function that you can directly lay out them and also change different shading variants, or to set up any variants settings here. For example, we have different variants for our forks asset, right? So we can, by clicking this variants shading, and we actually have the option to choose a different one. Yeah. So now we have we avoid the overlapping, and I want to organize them a little bit. I want to put this kind of small asset into one group. So Stage Manager provides this by you clicking this plus here, plus symbol here. I want to call this table items. And we can drag every asset into this group directly. Okay. So now, if we check the scene graph tree here, we actually have a prim group called table items, and we have different assets inside. And the next step, I want to organize it a little bit by using this configure primitive lob. So I want to change the kind of the small asset to be group 2. Right now it's component. So by specify all the items inside this table groups, table items. So now we can change the kind to be group. So now we can see we have all the drawn mode here. So this is a personal preference to organize this kind of stuff. It's not necessary. And the next step, we have our dining table here. We have our asset here. But you can see the asset is at the origin, but we have a different asset origin, a pivot here. So I want to use this reference lob to reference them together, to put the scene graph tree together. Okay. So just as the previous one, we changed the reference type to be reference from multi-input and connect assets to second input. Okay. So for the prim path here, we can directly select this table, this dining table here, and copy path to the reference primitive path. But you can see here we have this dining table path here, but I don't want to put them under this dining table. I want them to be parallel. I want to call this table items. So now you can see the pivot of small assets are actually aligned to the origin of this dining table. And if we check the scene graph tree here, I want to make a little bit room for this. We actually only have 2 stuff are active: the dining table and the table items, and the rest of them are deactivated. Okay, so now we can start to lay out them. The first thing is to move it above this dining table here by this transform lob. Okay, we can actually move it above this dining table, and then we can start using that physical editing. For example, we can select one of them. Okay, and by using this edit lob, and here is an option called use physics, or you can choose here use physics, turn it on, and when we lay out this, you can see it's actually automatically detect the collision object in the viewport. Yeah, or we can select all of them and do them once. Yeah, and this is a very handy way to do this kind of layout stuff job and make it more efficient and more natural. Yeah. So the last thing I want to mention is some personal experience and personal thoughts about when I'm working on this bar scene. That is actually, if you are, imagine that if you are working on a scene that is over like 200 or even 1,000 different items, and you need to prepare this kind of stuff. So what do? Are you actually trying to create this block of nodes 1,000 times? Some of this asset may have variant settings, and some of them may not. So in this bar scene, I actually have 67 different items. So my personal solution to this is actually to try to make it more procedural by creating importing asset process, because we already know a certain way to organize this asset, right? We with our group We under this group we have geometry and material, and we already know the object name, right? The barstool V1. So we can around this to build a workflow that can create this kind of stuff automatically, because we already know the place to save material, to read textures, to save the USD files. So the way I'm doing this is actually by writing some Python to do that. So this is the scripts I read for this, and that is actually doing this. So if we read one of the assets, for example, the dining plate here. Okay, so by specify the object file you want to use, and by specify the directory you want to read textures and save your USD files, and we can actually automatically create shaders and shading variants. I want to turn this off. Okay, so by import this asset, if we switch to stage, we can actually see, so this is the new generated nodes. Let me clean this a little bit. So as you can see, this asset is actually organized the way I did before: geometry, material, and different materials. So it will automatically detect how many different textures you have and how many different types of textures you have. For example, you have 5 different diffuse colors. That may saying that you need to set up different shading variants. Okay, so and create shaders automatically, link textures automatically, and create shading variants automatically. So I know my personal solution to this may have a lot of assumptions that I already know where the texture is, and I already know where the object file is, and I have a certain way to organize this asset. But I think the way is to try to make this workflow more efficient, to make this transition more smoothly and artist friendly. Okay, so that's about it, I guess. And yeah, here are some further topics. Oh yeah, I forgot to show something here. Yeah, this is very important. If you visit SideFX.com, by this content, under this get content library, you can actually see the Barstone example file here. Yeah, if you download that, it will actually contain all the USD assets you need, and the 2 different HIP files. The first one is about the import asset process. The second one is about how do you lay out them and the lighting setups. And I want to thanks Emily for creating these beautiful textures. And yeah, so and actually you can have more options in this parsing. That is about how about the instancing setups, the from lob to sub and back to lob workflow, and also randomize the materials on some references or instances. And you can play around with lighting setups, like use light mixer or light linker, and also trying to render it with Karma or other 3D party renderers. And yeah, so that's it. Thank you.